Today on the Perception and Action podcast, how does the ecological approach to skill acquisition change the way we think about movement creativity? How can we promote it through practice design? So it's time for a call to action. Hello, and thanks for joining me. This is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. If you're a coach or an instructor, my goal is to help you bridge the gap between research and application, and to connect your experiential knowledge with skill acquisition and motor learning theory. I want to help take you from using practice design recipes to becoming a master chef who can manipulate the key ingredients to come up with your own innovative training methods. If you're a student or fellow academic working in the skill acquisition field, I hope to keep you up to date on the latest studies and help you get to know the people working in this area. Finally, if you're developing training technologies, I hope to help you incorporate good motor learning principles in your design, pull out key performance metrics from the data, and design effective studies to evaluate your product. To learn more, help support the podcast, and or work directly with me, please check out perceptionaction.com. Now on to the show. Hi everyone, it's Rob Gray from the Perception Action podcast and ASU back with another article review. Today I want to look at the topic of creativity. This is and how we can promote it through practice design. This is something I talked about back in my interview with John Vanderkamp, who's done a lot of work in this area. And in that, we've talked a lot about how in the ecological approach, we have quite a different view of creativity. And this is something in my book that's hopefully coming out in a few months. I have a whole chapter that I've devoted to this. And the idea is, the traditional view of creativity is very much an asymmetric one. Creativity comes from mental processes, the things going on in our brain. The analogy I like to use is the symbol for creativity used to be Rodin's The Thinker, right? We sit there and think, we process things, we generate ideas, right? So it's very happening within our head. The new view, kind of the ecological view of creativity, is more of a symmetrical view, where creativity happens through an interaction with our environment, right? So I like to say we've switched from Rodin the Thinker to Explorer as a symbol for creativity. Creativity happens by interacting and exploring your environment, not by sitting there coming up with some unique solution first. Right? So that's the basic idea. And some good evidence. There's been some really interesting research, as I said, done by John Vanderkamp and Dominic Orth and colleagues on creativity, supporting this new view that it's really contingent more on exploration, interaction with your environment than on these mental processes. And a really good study I like is one from 2019 where they looked at martial arts. So what they did in this study was they looked at the relationship between working memory capacity and creativity in terms of kickboxing. So the idea here, right, the traditional view of creativity is the more things that I can hold in my memory and process and compare, which is working memory capacity, should be related to how creative I am, right? The more working memory capacity should give me more creativity. I can compare things, come up with original ideas. So to test this idea, what they did was they took 42 right-handed is going to be important, boxing novices. They gave them a standard working memory test. So a generalized test, right, that has nothing to do with the sport, right, which would, to foreshadow, we'd predict an ecological approach would have nothing to do with your skill because it's totally out of context. So they gave this and they used what's called a median split. They split the groups into high working memory capacity and low working memory capacity groups. And they gave them a task. Their main task was to strike the left side of a bag, a heavy bag that had a force sensor in it. For each person, they generated a threshold that they had to get above, right? What they did is they gave them a secondary task where essentially they had to listen for a phone number being read out over a speaker and repeated afterward. And the idea here was that the secondary task is going to use up some of your working memory capacity. So if working memory capacity is really important for generating creative actions, then people that have low working memory capacity, if you give them this extra task, they should have a real struggle coming up with creative activities. So a creative action, that's important in this research. Creative actions have to have two things, right? They have to be functional, right? If you do something different from everybody that doesn't achieve your goal, then that's just a bad movement solution. It's not a creative one. So it has to meet your goal in this case, which is being above the force threshold, and it has to be somewhat rare. So what they did in the study was they looked at all the actions used by all the people in their study, all 42 across all the things, and they classified something as rare if it occurred less than 5% of the time. Right. So remember, so there's some in the, they have images in the book, and I have them in the slides if you're listening. So you could do a left hook to the left side of the bag. You could hit it with the right side of your backhand of your right hand. You could do a spin. There's lots of different maneuvers you could do. You could kick it, right? There's lots of different moves you could do to generate go above this force threshold. Right. The key thing, though, to point out at this point, right, is they're hitting the left side of their bag and they're all right-handed. Right. That was an important thing. So what they found essentially was there was no effect of working memory capacity at all on the level of creativity. In fact, the people that had the lower working memory capacity generated more creative actions that were rare, these rare ones that got above the threshold. It wasn't significant, but the direction was in the opposite to what you predict. They also had a higher success rate. So there was no relationship at all, which is kind of what we predict in the working memory, in the ecological approach. What was related to it was search factors, right? In particular, where the person started. So if they really started by hitting the left hand, right, with the left side of the bag, that created a really strong, what we call in dynamical systems, a local minimum, right? So hitting the left side of your bag, you can get it above the threshold. Hitting the left side of the bag with your left hand, you're going to get above threshold. So it's going to establish a good attractor there. You're achieving your goal, but it's going to probably pull you in and keep you from better solutions, right? You're right-handed. You're stronger with your right hand. So a lot of the people that started with the left-hand thing got stuck there, and they just kind of tweaked the angle and the force of their arm rather than exploring other things. So they got stuck in a local minimum. So that predicted how many creative actions people generated. Also, obviously, the amount people switched, right? The people that started using the right side of the body or spin or so came up with more creative actions, right? So very consistent with the ecological approach. The study I want to talk about today, the newer one, is this one coming up by Orangi and colleagues, again with John Vanderkamp, published just this year, looking at how practice design affects creativity, right? So again, from an ecological approach. So this study is really a kind of a mirror of a study that I talked about earlier this year, in which the authors looked at the effect of practice design on injury mechanisms, right? So what they did in that study, and you can look up the video, or there's a podcast episode as well, it's titled Variability of Practice as an Injury Prevention Mechanism. What they did in that study was they compared traditional prescriptive soccer coaching, where they give you, here's how you pass, here's how you shoot, this is where your body should be. They compared it with differential learning, where you tried lots of different body postures, and a constraints-led approach, where they were kind of guiding you to different solutions. And what they found in that study was they found that the markers of ACL injury in terms of forces and angles were lower in the two ecological groups, the self-organization groups, differential learning and constraints. So basically, they repeated the same design with this, but instead of measuring injury factors, they measured creativity, right? So they had all groups practicing shooting, dribbling, passing, and soccer, right? There was three groups. The one they call the linear group, which is a traditional one where they prescribed the solution. Here's how you should kick. This is where your foot should be. Then they had a nonlinear group where they had different constraints, right, in terms of, small-sided games, the missimulated task constraints, very much the same pattern. And then they had a differential learning where you were told to operate, do different postures. So they did this training, and then they looked after, again, they used the same criteria for creative actions. What they did was they were looking for ones that were successful. You got the shot on goal, you made the pass, but they were also rare in terms of all the moves they collected, and they're again using the 5% threshold. And what did they find? Right. So what they found was the number of creative actions per player was significantly higher in both the constraints-led approach, the nonlinear group, and the differential learning group than in so there was just over 1 and almost 1 in the differential learning and constraints, whereas it was less than a half per player in the prescriptive, right? So again, evidence that these nonlinear methods, these ecological methods that promote self-organization and allow for exploration are, not surprisingly, leading to more creativity. Okay. Here's another example from the data showing the number of heel passes versus chip passes. So they broke down head dribbling, a lot. So they broke it down into specific actions. The numbers that you get, that you see, are significantly higher again in the constraints group and the differential learning group for all these different kind of. So they broke it down into specific actions. You can see there, or we can look at the paper. So this overall seems to again provide support that creativity comes through exploration and a symmetrical interaction with your environment, establishing relationships with your environment, which are encouraged by using things like the constraints that approach in differential learning in practice. Rather, they lead to more exploration, more variability in solution. So it's not, again, this study combined with the Vanderkamp and Orth's earlier work, moving away from the idea that creativity is this asymmetrical process that happens in your head, and then you just send your solution out to the environment, to a symmetrical one, that we always try to promote an ecological approach, that it really lies within the interaction between you and environments, establishing control laws, things like that. So I think this is a really interesting study. It fits nicely with the injury one I did earlier, and I've added it to, if you go to my website, you'll find I have a running list of studies that directly compared ecological approaches like differential learning constraints to traditional coaching, and I've added this paper to the list. So very, very nice work in a really difficult topic to study. So that's it for today. Remember, if you want to help support this podcast and some of the new initiatives, please check out patreon.com/perception action, and you can get some content, including we have monthly meetups of the Patreon supporters if you're interested in joining. So that's it for now. Thanks for joining me, and cheers for now, and keep them coupled. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter @ShakyWaves. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled.